What if I told you that one phone call, one announcement, one single open challenge from the most dangerous man to ever set foot in a WWE ring could completely change the trajectory of an entire generation of wrestling? Because that's exactly what happened. And the man who heard the challenge, the man who stood up, looked into the camera, and said, "I accept," without blinking, without hesitating, without a single moment of fear, that man is Oba Femi. And the wrestling world has not been the same since. Welcome back to Wrestling Impact. If you are new here, you picked the perfect day to find this channel, because what we're breaking down today is one of those moments that wrestling fans will be talking about for years. We're talking Brock Lesnar, the Beast Incarnate, throwing open a challenge at the grandest stage of them all, WrestleMania, and Oba Femi, the Nigerian Nightmare, the most physically imposing young force in professional wrestling today, stepping up to answer it. Strap in. This is going to be a ride. Let's paint this picture properly, because context matters. You cannot fully appreciate what Oba Femi did without understanding who Brock Lesnar is and what an open challenge at WrestleMania actually means in the wrestling ecosystem. Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania is not just a match. It's an event within an event. Every time that music hits on that stage, every time that pyro explodes and you see that silhouette at the top of the ramp, the stadium doesn't just get loud, it gets electric in a way that very few things in sports entertainment ever achieve. Brock Lesnar carries with him the weight of decades of destruction. We're talking about a man who has conquered the UFC Heavyweight Championship, who has defeated legends, who has ended streaks that people thought were unbreakable. Brock Lesnar issuing an open challenge is not just a wrestling angle, it is a gauntlet being thrown down at the feet of every single person in that locker room. And most of those people look at that gauntlet and they walk the other way. But not Oba Femi. Now let's talk about where Oba Femi was in his career when this moment happened, because the timing here is everything. Oba Femi had been on an absolute warpath. This young man, and I want you to really appreciate how young we're talking, had been bulldozing his way through competition with a combination of raw athleticism, physical dominance, and a mental fortitude that you simply cannot teach. You watch Oba Femi in the ring and you see something that only comes along once in a very long time. You see someone who was built for this. 6 feet 5 inches of pure muscle, and yet he moves like someone half his size. He's got the agility of a cruiserweight and the power of a super heavyweight, and when he puts those two things together, the result is something genuinely terrifying. But here's the thing about Oba Femi that separates him from every other young talent who might have looked at that Lesnar challenge and daydreamed about stepping up. Oba Femi doesn't daydream. He doesn't fantasize. He calculates. He evaluates. And then he acts. And when word spread backstage that Brock Lesnar had issued an open challenge for WrestleMania, an open challenge with no name attached, no stipulations, just a flat-out declaration that he would fight anybody willing to walk through that curtain, the locker room went quiet. Because everyone knows what happens to people who fight Brock Lesnar unprepared. And then Oba Femi's reaction leaked, and the internet exploded. Picture it, someone gets Oba Femi on camera, right after the announcement drops, and they ask him what he thinks about Lesnar's open challenge. And Oba Femi, without missing a single beat, without cracking a smile, without any of the nervous energy you'd expect from someone staring down the most decorated destroyer in wrestling history, just looks directly into that camera and says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I want you to feel this, he says, "The challenge was always meant for me. Brock just doesn't know it yet." That is the energy. That is the confidence. And the wrestling community absolutely lost their minds. Because here's the divide that happened in real time. On one side, you had the veterans, the old-school fans, the people who've watched Lesnar dismantle legends, who said Oba Femi was writing checks his body couldn't cash. They said it with love, they said it with respect for Oba's talent, but they said it with the certainty of people who've seen this play out before. Young star steps up to the beast, gets his moment in the spotlight, and then gets folded in half and sent back down to earth with a reality check that echoes for months. But on the other side, and this is where it gets fascinating, you had the next generation of wrestling fans, the people who'd watched Oba Femi's entire rise, who'd been in arenas when he did things that made you physically jump out of your seat, and those fans were saying something completely different. They were saying this might be the one. This might be the moment where the torch doesn't just get passed, it gets snatched. And that tension, that beautiful conflict between two legitimate schools of thought, is exactly what makes great wrestling storylines so compelling. Because neither side is wrong. Both arguments have merit. And that ambiguity, that genuine uncertainty about what happens when the unstoppable force meets the next immovable object, that's wrestling magic. Now let's get into the actual reaction moment in detail, because Oba Femi's response wasn't just that one quote. What happened over the following days after Lesnar's challenge dropped was a masterclass in psychological warfare from a young competitor who clearly understands that wrestling is as much a mental game as it is a physical one. First came the initial reaction clip, which spread like wildfire. But then Oba Femi did something smart. He didn't flood the zone. He didn't come out the next week with a long promo. He let the moment breathe. He let the internet stew. He let people debate. And every single day that passed without a formal response was another day that Brock Lesnar's challenge hung in the air, unanswered, growing heavier and heavier, and Oba Femi's name attached to it just kept getting bigger and bigger. It was strategic silence. And it was brilliant. Then came the response promo, and this is where Oba Femi truly announced himself to a mainstream audience that might not have been paying close attention yet. Because when he finally spoke, when he finally addressed Brock Lesnar's challenge with the full weight of the moment behind him, it wasn't a young man trying to sound tough. It was a young man who genuinely, in his bones, believed every single word he was saying. And there is a profound difference between performing confidence and possessing it. Oba Femi possesses it. He talked about legacy. He talked about what it means to come from where he comes from, to have worked through every single obstacle that's been put in his path, to have earned every single piece of ground he's taken. And then he looked at the camera and said something that I think will define his career for a long time. He essentially said that Brock Lesnar built his legend on fear, on the idea that nobody could survive him, and that he, Oba Femi, was going to walk into WrestleMania and prove that the Beast is mortal. The crowd reaction was immediate. The social media reaction was immediate. Even people who'd been skeptical started to lean forward in their chairs. Because you could feel it. You could feel that this wasn't performance. This was belief. And belief, in professional wrestling, is the most contagious thing in the world. Now let's talk about what this matchup would mean, the stakes, the implications, the consequences for both men, because that's what turns a wrestling match into an event. For Brock Lesnar, an open challenge at WrestleMania is a statement about legacy. It's him saying, I have nothing left to prove, and yet here I am, and I will prove it again to whoever dares. Every open challenge Lesnar has ever issued has been answered, and every single one of those answers has ended the same way, with the challenger learning an extremely painful lesson. A victory for Lesnar here is validation of the myth. It adds another chapter to an already overstuffed book of dominance. But here's the subtle layer: if Lesnar wins clean over a competitor as talented and as physically imposing as Oba Femi, it actually does something fascinating. It makes Lesnar look even more supernatural. Because if this monster of a young man can't stop him, then what chance does anyone have? But for Oba Femi, a victory here doesn't just change his career. It changes his life. It changes his legacy before it's even fully written. Defeating Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania is the kind of result that defines an era. There are matches in wrestling history where you can point to a single moment and say, that is when everything changed. That is when this person became something bigger than a wrestler. They became an icon. And a clean, hard-fought victory over the Beast Incarnate at the grandest stage of them all would put Oba Femi in a conversation that very, very few people his age have ever even been invited into. And that's why the wrestling world is watching this so closely. Because we all understand what's on the table. Imagine the moment. WrestleMania. Tens of thousands of fans inside that stadium. The entire world watching at home. Brock Lesnar's music hits and the reaction is what it always is: primal, thunderous, divided between cheers and boos in pure awe. Lesnar walks down that aisle and the stadium feels smaller somehow, like his presence physically compresses the space around him. He gets in the ring. He grabs a microphone. And he says those words: whoever's brave enough, whoever's stupid enough, whoever thinks they have what it takes, the challenge is open. Step up. And then the drums hit. And the arena shifts. Because Oba Femi's entrance at the moment like this would be something to behold. You'd feel it before you heard it. The energy in the building would change. And when he walks through that curtain, when he stands at the top of that stage and locks eyes with Brock Lesnar from across that arena, that visual alone would be worth everything. Two forces of nature. Two different eras of dominance. One ring. One night. WrestleMania. The match itself, and I want you to picture this even if it hasn't happened yet, the match itself would be unlike almost anything we've seen in recent years. Because Oba Femi is one of the only people on the current roster who doesn't have to compensate for a size disadvantage against Lesnar. He can match him physically. He can make this a fight. And Brock Lesnar, whatever else you want to say about him, is at his absolute best when he's in there with someone who can genuinely push him. When Lesnar has to actually dig deep when his opponent doesn't fold after the first suplex, that's when we see the full range of what makes Brock Lesnar one of the most compelling performers in wrestling history. Oba Femi would survive the first German suplex. That alone would be a moment. Because the crowd reacts to that. Because fans know what that suplex usually means. And when Oba gets back up, when he rolls his neck and looks at Lesnar like he's more annoyed than hurt, you'd feel the entire stadium recalibrate. This is different. This is not the usual story. And then the momentum shifts. And then Oba starts fighting back. And the building starts to believe. That's the thing about crowd energy in a match like this, it's not just background noise. It becomes part of the story. Every reversal, every near fall, every moment where Oba kicks out and the crowd collectively gasps and then roars, that's thousands of people becoming emotionally invested in a result that hasn't been written yet, at least not for them. That's the magic of professional wrestling at its purest. The near falls would be devastating, and I mean that in the best possible way. The kind of near falls where the referee's hand hits the mat a second time and the stadium thinks it's over, and then that shoulder comes up and the sound that comes out of that crowd is unlike anything else in sports entertainment. Pure, unfiltered disbelief and hope and joy and anxiety all wrapped into one massive collective exhale. And then in whatever form it takes, whether it's the F5 or the finish of Oba's own devastating finisher connecting cleanly, the match reaches its conclusion. And however that conclusion lands, the conversation about these two men, and specifically about Oba Femi's willingness to step up and answer a challenge that nobody else would answer, becomes permanent. You cannot take that back. You cannot erase what it meant for a young competitor to look at the most feared name in wrestling, at the biggest show in wrestling, and say with his full chest, "I'm the one." That moment of courage, that single act of stepping forward when everyone else stepped back, is what separates the legends from the very good. It's what separates the people who have great careers from the people who define eras. And Oba Femi, by accepting Brock Lesnar's open challenge at WrestleMania, has inserted himself permanently into that second category regardless of the final bell. The wrestling world isn't just watching. The wrestling world is witnessing something. A generational talent announcing himself on the biggest possible stage, in the most dramatic possible fashion, against the most imposing possible opponent. This is the kind of moment that you remember exactly where you were when you watched it. This is the kind of moment that kids who are wrestling fans right now will tell their own kids about someday. And we are right here, right now, watching it unfold in real time on Wrestling Impact. So here's what I want from you, because this conversation is just getting started. Down in the comments right now, I want to know, do you believe Oba Femi can actually slay the Beast at WrestleMania? Do you think he's ready? Or do you think this is a moment of incredible bravery that ends with a very difficult lesson? Give me your take, full opinion, don't hold back, because the comments section on this video is going to be one for the books and I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed to Wrestling Impact yet, what are you doing? Seriously. This is the channel that brings you the breakdowns, the analysis, the storytelling that makes wrestling feel the way it felt the first time you ever fell in love with it. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the like button on this video if Oba Femi stepping up to Lesnar gave you chills, because it absolutely should have. And stay locked in, because we are going to cover every single development in this story as it happens. Oba Femi heard the challenge. He answered. And the wrestling world will never be the same. This has been Wrestling Impact, and we'll see you in the next one.